Hi folks, welcome to the A Minute to Midnight Show. I'm Tony and coming to you from New Zealand at this current time. Now I've got on the show today Lynette Zang, who, well, Lynette was quite a frequent guest till, I guess it's been a couple of years probably now since you've been on, Lynette, but welcome back, and you've had changes.
Oh, lots of changes, and I'm very happy to be back. So thank you for having me back, Tony.
Yes.
I missed you.
Yes, same. It's great. It's good timing because obviously there's tons happening. Before we get into it, do you just want to maybe explain to people, because you were with ITM before, ITM Trading, now you're not. So if people are looking for you online, where do they find you now?
Well, they can find me at LynetteZang.com, and I'm the founder and CEO of Zang Enterprises. And of course, we are a full service physical metals house. But we've gone back to my original strategy, which is a sound money strategy, and it incorporates all the parts of the mantra. So food, water, energy security, barterability, wealth preservation, community, and shelter. And they can find me on YouTube and Twitter at the Lynette Zang, and on Instagram and Facebook at Lynette Zang. So I'm very visible.
That's great. Yeah. Now, sound money. We'll talk about that shortly. What that is. And there is so much going on. Obviously, there's tons that we could cover. I just want to start off with something though that's a little interesting. Zimbabwe. Okay. What's just happened in Zimbabwe, and kind of why is it important? I mean, to most people, I think Zimbabwe, who cares about that? It's just some little back third world African country, but there are lessons there.
Oh, there are a bazillion lessons there, and we need to pay attention because, you know, we've spoken so much over the years, but I've been following what's been going on in Zimbabwe with their currency since 2006. And this was now the failure of the sixth iteration of their currency. And this one, look, the problem is that the hyperinflation that Zimbabwe has experienced and the lopping off of zeros and then another bout of hyperinflation constantly, the public has lost all confidence. And yes, we're talking about Zimbabwe, but I've also been tracking how confidence on a global basis has been declining markedly over these last few years, and there was a rise in populism that was gaining a lot of steam in 2019, right? Well, guess what, Tony? It's gathering a lot of steam again in 2024, even though it had that little bit of a break. And so in order to and this is what has happened 100% of the time, over 4,800 currencies, government-based, debt-based currencies that do not exist anymore. So what happens is it's a Ponzi scheme and it requires confidence. And when all confidence in the currency and the leaders are lost, what they do is they put a component of gold into that currency to regain that confidence. And that's what Zimbabwe did in April. They now have had an quote unquote asset-backed currency. But the interesting thing, I mean, there's so many interesting things about it, but a couple of years ago, to help people maintain their purchasing power, Zimbabwe issued 1 ounce gold coins. Great, because gold does maintain your purchasing power. The elites could afford those 1 ounce gold coins, the public could not. So when they came out with the new currency, the ZiG for Zimbabwe gold, they eliminated anybody's ability to buy any more of those 1 ounce coins. And they've been through royalties, which is a form of confiscation, requiring the Zimbabwean gold miners to sell to the government 20% of their production in the local currency, which does not match what gold is even in the global spot markets. And so it is definitely a form of confiscation. But when they did the asset back, and the reason why it's important is not just for the currency, but we have lots and lots of talk about all of these asset-backed cryptocurrencies, these asset-backed this, these asset-backed that. If you cannot convert it into the underlying asset, how do you know that it's really there? And so the problem with the ZiG, the Zimbabwe gold currency that was supposedly backed by lots of gold and lots of foreign currencies, mostly dollars, but through this whole process, I could not get the specifics on it. Even at the Central Bank of Zimbabwe, why was this so hazy and so impossible to find? And last on the 26th, if you went to bed at night in Zimbabwe and you had 100 ZiG in the bank, when you woke up that next morning, you had something like 58 ZiG in the bank. They did that overnight revaluation, and it's only, 5-6 months into this new currency where they vowed that they wouldn't do this, printing all of that money to devalue the ZiG, and then they did it. So, yeah. And they said, I love this because this is always the reasoning, and I don't mean just the Central Bank of Zimbabwe, but the Federal Reserve and all this. We want to anchor those inflation expectations. Yeah, because it wasn't working. They weren't getting adoption. And then they did exactly what they said they weren't going to do by printing a whole lot of money and overnight devaluation. But not hyperinflation because it was only 44%. Officially, hyperinflation is 50%. I'm pretty sure salaries didn't go up all that to compensate for it. Debt didn't change to compensate for it. Yeah. So that's what just happened in Zimbabwe. And it's important on so many levels. But that was actually a real time experiment of how to, at least the government attempts to regain the population's confidence with gold. But of course, they were lying because you couldn't convert the ZiG into any amount of gold. And by the way, they didn't even have cash. They just had it in digital form. Yeah.
Well, that, of course, is the way they're all trying to go with the digital currencies. And I'm sitting there while you're saying that, because we don't really know then how much gold is Zimbabwe even got. And then with the US, there's supposedly all this gold in Fort Knox and all that, but no one's seen it since the 1950s. So, but there will be naysayers, I'm sure, saying, oh, well, there you go, gold-backed currencies don't work. Why should we bother with gold? But the reality is that the price of gold now is at record levels. Silver is quite high, but still nowhere near record levels. But what direction do you see this going? Where do you think this is heading?
Well, there's absolutely zero doubt in my mind because of all of the technical data that supports it. But right now, we're in a global interest rate pivot of the central banks, right? Because the markets were going down. If they don't keep pumping new money, every Ponzi scheme requires new players and new money, right?
Yeah.
So the opposite was happening, and we were going into, we are still going into a way bigger than a recession. I mean, in my opinion, this pivot to drop the interest rates and print more money because that's all they have will send us into an obvious hyperinflation that I believe, because we're already headed in this direction, that will eliminate whatever little bit of confidence is yet in the system, because it won't take very long for inflation to really be very, very noticeable again.
So what's driving the increase in the price of gold, and do you see that continuing?
Oh my gosh. Yes, I do see that continuing, and gold and silver aren't even really near their true fundamental value. And I see for both of them a continuance of up. For silver, I think maybe by the end of this year, and timing is the biggest challenge, but it would not surprise me to see silver conclude its cup formation, which in the US is roughly $50 an ounce by the end of this year, and we're in October. So this last quarter, for gold, that these are both spot market contracts, right? And what's pushing them is what's happening geopolitically. I mean, are we on the verge of World War III? Some things we're already in it in cyberspace, but can another war pop up in Asia? Yeah, it can. So that's going to move it. The geopolitical pressure, the inflation pressure, right? Yeah. All of the ports have shut down in the U.S. on the eastern seaboard and through the Gulf of Mexico. 36 ports. The unions have gone on strike, and that's going to have an impact on the supply chain, at least in the U.S., but also in any imports that we're doing. So that just happened, and we'll feel the ramifications from that. But what you're going to have is you're going to have the central banks pointing their fingers to the geopolitical for the reason why there's this inflation, for the breakup of the supply chain with the ports going on strike as a reason for inflation. But the reality is, when you go into the Federal Reserve's Education Department website, the FRED, anybody can do it. It's free. Everybody anywhere in the world has access. And you put in that bar financial conditions in the search bar, financial conditions. What you will see is that much as we've heard about all of the central banks talk about tightening conditions, the conditions have not been tight because there's been so much excess liquidity pumped into this system since 2008 and all of that free money that the central banks are now easing, in other words, lowering interest rates to inspire inflation into an environment that is already as easy or near as easy as it has ever been historically. And as far as I can find, this is the first time that the U.S. has entered a major easing cycle into a cycle that was already this easy. And a big part of that is why I say we are going to see inflation rise very rapidly from this. Very rapidly.
Okay, so with the Fed rate cut and all that, so what about debt service? Can you explain, what the go is with that? What does that mean and what's happening with it?
Oh, absolutely. Anybody, I don't care whether you're a government, you're a corporation, or an individual, you have to deal with debt. You have to either pay it, pay it on a monthly basis, pay it off, roll it over, or default with it. Well, a lot of these corporations, when the Federal Reserve dropped interest rates down to zero, the implied goal, because they didn't make it specific, of course not, but the implied goal was that these corporations and these governments could retire more expensive debt for this cheap debt. And then their debt service, how much they had to put out regularly, would go down. That was the theory. The reality was that with those interest rates so low, governments and corporations could and did take on more debt for the same amount of debt service, but they've also gone to shorter and shorter and shorter maturities. So when the central banks started raising those rates, and there's something else about it too I'll come back to, but when the central banks started raising those rates and governments, corporations, and individuals had to roll over that debt that they had at lower interest rates into higher interest rates, well, what we're seeing, especially on the consumer end, but also on the corporate end, is that the default rate is spiking. because they couldn't afford it, right? So a big reason why I personally think that the interest rates had to drop down was because this massive debt wall that must be restructured had to be restructured for governments especially, as well as for corporations, had to be restructured at lower interest rates so that the corporations and governments, well, governments can qualify because they just print the debt, but corporations could qualify for taking on and rolling that debt over. The other huge problem is that if this is interest rates, this is the market value of the debt, right? So as the 40-year trend, as central banks lowered the interest rates, the market value of the debt went up. So that also enabled them to take on more debt. But the reverse has been true since 22. And so all of these banks, I don't care if you're talking about a JP Morgan global systemically important bank or a smaller bank, all of the debt that they took on in that 15-year cycle of zero interest rates is completely underwater in terms of the market. And so, and when we're talking about debt, let's be clear that that's treasury debt, corporate bonds, other government bonds, but that's also all of the mortgages, all of the auto loans, all of the student loans, all of the credit card loans, all of that debt. So now, if somebody like we've been witnessing, if a depositor gets nervous about a bank and there is a bank run, well, all of the cash that you deposit, it's not sitting in a vault. They've put it into some garbage, some, derivative bets or bonds or whatever. And if they're forced to sell them, it's going to be obvious that they're insolvent.
And what about governments? I mean, theoretically, how is the amount of debt that the US government now has and the interest rates and all that? I mean, how does that all figure?
Yeah, that's exactly right. The government is absolutely insolvent, and the deficits that we're running are at nosebleed level. And it didn't just start because in the US in particular, and my guess would be that pretty much all other countries are the same as this, but already in 2009, when I did a study, because I'm looking at the deficits, right? You can go to the Fed chart, you can pull up the deficits, and up until 2008, deficit spending was not horrendous, right? That's deficit spending started in the 70s. It was not horrendous. It wasn't, and even after 2008, it went to $1 trillion, and yet we were servicing at that time 13 trillion. Now it's like 36 trillion that we know of, but a lot of this can be done off balance sheets and it's hidden. But okay, let's go with that. And again, going back to the Fed, I can go behind it to the underlying data. And what I saw was that the taxable income that the government, or not the taxable income, but the taxes and the fees that the government got in as their income was not enough to pay all the interest on the debt, let alone any of the principal. And we know as individuals, if you have a credit card and you're paying the minimum and you're not paying all of that interest that you don't pay then goes into the principal. And now you're paying interest on top of interest. So when you're looking at, so that was really the difference between the trillion and the 13 trillion is compounding interest. In the US, don't hold me to this because I don't have that data right in front of me. But if I'm not mistaken, and Adam, if I'm wrong, just correct me, please. But I'm pretty sure we're spending $1 trillion a day in interest on that debt. Are we taking in $1 trillion a day in taxes? No, we are not. So, even dropping, and that's the point, right? Even dropping the interest rates back to zero, which I'm certain we're going to see ZIRP again. There's no choice about it, right? That's about creating inflation. The government's plans from the beginning, it's set up, it's baked into the way they created the monetary system. The way they created it was so that the government would take on debt and then they would actually just keep compounding the interest. But if they did have to repay any of the debt, they were repaying it with currency that had less and less and less value. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right? Through inflation, the purchasing power of the value declined. And so what governments do, especially advanced governments like in the US, is they hyperinflate the currency, but this is going to be global. This isn't just the US. Wipe out all of the debt so that we can start over with a clean slate. And the reality is this has become, really, I think since the last time we spoke, I did an event in Australia and it changed my life, Tony. It just changed my life because I threw away the materials that I had prepared. I mean, I gave it to the people that came, but I started talking about community. And when I started talking about community, I got chills from the tip of my head to the bottom of my feet. And I really realized that my real mission here is, yes, you've got to have a sound money foundation, but we need, as a global population, we need to come together and create this quiet revolution where we are voting with our wallets and converting the money that they can control the value with into universal money, gold and silver, that they can control the spot market, but they don't control the purchasing power value. They don't do that because it's universal money. Local money, universal money. And so my big mission has been to lead, this is going to sound funny, but community has arguably become the single most important thing that I ever talk about, both locally, because things get very, 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 very narrow. And we all around the world probably experienced what we couldn't get that we were used to getting during the cerveza disease. That was a big, huge warning. I think the U.S. is in for it again with all of the dock workers strike that's going on, because that too is going to have a major impact.
Plus the hurricane and all that,
Yeah, exactly, right? So on a local basis, when these things happen, things get very, very local. So silver is a nice sound money foundation for your barterability, but coming together in community, getting to know who grows your food, go to a farmer's market, go to a community garden, reach out to your neighbors, start growing a little bit of food. But if you know somebody that's growing it, or you can introduce yourself, give them a day of your labor. You'll learn a new skill. You'll create that relationship. And if that person has to choose between you getting food and somebody they absolutely don't know at all getting food, guess who's going to get it? And build that local community to ensure that you have security in the food, water, energy, security itself, barterability, wealth preservation, community, and shelter. But globally, we have to come together and create a sound money movement, peaceful, quiet, just by converting your government fiat money into physical gold and silver that you hold in your possession. Because I believe that if we can do this together on a global basis, We can demand a seat at the table for the new financial system that's coming in. And if I'm the one that's sitting at that chair, at that table, I am going to fight to have it convertible. I'm not saying that the currency is going to be 100% back, but whatever that backing is, you gotta be able to convert it, or it's just more lip service. And the intention is a full surveillance economy where you don't like what we're saying, you are, boom, cut off. And we see these governments are really aggressive. But, we started out with Zimbabwe, and I saw this huge sign. There was a protest that was going on in the streets of Zimbabwe, and they had this huge sign. And I'm telling you, even thinking about it now, I'm getting chills because it's like true. And it said, and I betcha your viewers, your listeners are saying this to themselves too, but I'm only one person. What can I do? Said 7 billion people.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Yeah. Together, I've got chills. I don't know if we can do this or not, but I know if we don't even try, we have absolutely no shot at coming up and entering a more fair system. This one has to die. It's too abused. It's too bloated. There's too much garbage that's in there. And everybody, I think, can easily see that, this is a club. And you and me, Tony, we're not in that club. And you know what? But we can make our own club and we can take our power back. That's what we have to do.
So people can do that, growing their own food and getting in community, which I think is hugely important. I know we're running out of time because you've got another interview, but, gold, and for a lot of people before, they were going, we can't afford it, So now it's gone up even more. So, people have either got it now or can't afford it largely. What do you suggest to those people before we close up?
Well, number one, I want everybody to know that gold and silver in any form is monetary at its base. So honestly, there are so many different ways that you can accumulate both gold and silver. And second of all, you don't have to do it in 1 ounce form. You can do it in itty bitty form, right? Fractional form. And then that also. But rather than saying I can't afford it, you can't not afford it, right? You can't not afford it. But also coming together in community, maybe this member of your community has it. Maybe you bring in barterable skills that they need. That's why I say go volunteer on a farm. There's always work to be done on a farm. I don't know one farmer that would say, no, we got it covered. They're going to say, come, and you'll learn some new skills that will be invaluable to your survival in this.
True.
So that's what I would say. You can't not afford it. There are all different ways to do it. You have to kind of figure it out. And I was talking to somebody earlier that said that what he did was driving a Lyft, driving an Uber, right?
Yeah.
For extra money to put into this, right? So instead of buying that nice shirt or whatever, buy a piece of silver, buy a piece of gold. And it's not even buying it. It's converting garbage that is losing value. That's the inflation, right? You're fixing its purchasing power in this and in this. I did a little study just a little while ago, the beginning of September actually, and I took a food basket from the Bureau of Labor Statistics in 1913 and again in the beginning of September 1924. And it's the same basket from the same entity. And what I found was that the cost of food in the U.S. had gone up over 2,500% during that time period. If you had silver, even the manipulated spot market was up over 2,900%. So silver maintained your ability to buy the same basket of food. That's why I like it for barterability. But gold was up over 12,000%, and it's still way below, both of them, still way below their true fundamental value. So you can't not afford it. There's always, where there's a will, there's a way. But community, while you're gathering this, get that community together. Please do yourself a favor. Get that community together.
And if people want to get in contact with you and get advice, can they do that?
Oh, 100% they can do that. And you can reach us at, we love phone calls, so 833-GLD-ZANG, or that translates into 833-453-9264. Again, they can email us at hello@LynetteZang.com or questions@LynetteZang.com. They can leave comments on YouTube and on Twitter. We're easy to get a hold of.
Awesome. Well, I'll let you go because I know you've got to race off to this next interview, but that was a short but fascinating interview, and look, we'll have to do it again soon and not leave a big gap again.
No more big gaps. Yeah. No more big gaps.
Awesome. Thank you, Lynette. It was great having you back.
Thank you, Tony. I'll see you soon.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.
Folks, also remember to subscribe to aminutomidnight.com, and we have YouTube, Rumble and BitChute channels and Apple Podcasts as well. But primarily our website, you'll find our articles and all of our shows. And we do run A Minute to Midnight 100% by donations. If anyone is able to help us, it's always greatly appreciated. And you can do that at our website, aminutomidnight.com. Well, God bless, and God willing, we'll be back with another episode in a few days' time.